Hello, in this video I'm going to basically give a simple overview of the whole process of creating a render in Chunky from start to finish. So here you can see that I have already selected some chunks in the map view, and to do that you simply shift click and drag, or rather shift click and drag like so, to select the chunks that you want, and you can do it again on something that's already been selected, I believe. How do I don't remember how to. Oh, you just click. You should be able to just shift click on something that's already been selected in order to deselect it. Shift click to deselect, and it gives you a little box outlining the area that you would be deselecting or selecting. Okay, so I already have a texture pack or resource pack now loaded, which I'm using Conquest Resource Pack in this case, if anyone cares. So the first thing you'll want to do after you select your chunks is just hit New Scene here, and now it's going to load up all your chunks. And in this case, I have quite a lot of chunks. It's 44,342 chunks, so this is going to take quite a while to load. So I will cut the video here, and I will get back once it has loaded. Alright, all of the chunks have been loaded, and this is what we are greeted with. So we have a square window here, 400 by 400. This is the default, and, well, you can change the default, but this is what it is by default. And we're looking at the ground in the center of all the chunks that we have loaded. By the way, all these 44,000 chunks take up a great deal of memory. So you can see here that I'm actually using 20 gigs of RAM just for Chunky. So if you don't have a lot of RAM, this program is not going to be able to load nearly as many chunks as you may like. So do keep that in mind. So anyway, we're going to first, I like to change it to the aspect ratio that I'm going to use, so I'm just going to make a simple 1080p or maybe 4K render today. So I'm just going to choose this, which is half of 1080p. It's one of the presets that you can choose here. And actually maybe I'll make it smaller just so I can move around more quickly. So to move the camera up, you're pressing R, and to move it down, you press F. And then WASD, standard movement keys for everything else. If you hold down Control and then press a movement key, you will move faster. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to find the camera angle that I want. So I'll figure out, what do I actually want to show in my render, and I think since I rendered so much, or I loaded so many chunks, that I should be able to do some nice landscape photography today. So I think what I'll do is I'll go somewhere over here, maybe over by this work in progress castle deal, and I think this might be a good view. So I'm going to make it a bit bigger so I can actually see what's going on here, and we're going to want to choose what's in focus. So I'm thinking this volcano over here might be a good point to focus on, so we'll set the autofocus to that, and then we'll point back in the direction that we want to point. And then I'm thinking I want to actually move out a bit and then zoom the camera in to put the background a bit larger, compress the foreground a bit here so we can get more in the frame, and then we're going to decrease the depth of field just a little bit so that the foreground is maybe a bit blurry, not too much. Pretty large depth of field here, but this should simulate some more realistic camera properties. So next I'm just going to press the play button here just to see what it looks like with the default lighting settings. So already I can see that I'm going to want to definitely lower the altitude of the sun, because right now everything is just sort of too bright. There's not really too much dynamic range going on here, or everything's just really bright. So we're going to want to put more contrast in, and to do that we're going to want lighting that has lots of shadows, so we're not just using the bright end of the spectrum here. So I'm going to choose something around, I guess it's 18 here. I could choose anything else that's somewhere around 20. And now comes sort of the hard part, which is choosing the actual direction of the sunlight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it smaller. I'm going to press play so I can see in real time what direction the sun's coming from. And I'm going to just move the sun around until I think it looks good. So I'm thinking that right there already looks pretty good, so I might just go with that. So in this case you can see that everything is sort of pretty well lit up, but on everything that's sort of to the right of the screen has shadows on it, and everything facing the left of the screen is going to be lit up because that's where the sun is. So that looks pretty nice. So now we're going to want to determine what we want the color of the sun to be, because this is going to create a pretty drastic effect. So you can see all this snow here. Because of the sky is blue and the snow is white, the snow is actually going to appear somewhat blue. And so in order to sort of eliminate that, I'm going to put in a more orangish glow. And this is going to create sort of a sunrise effect like you would get in real life. So the next thing I'll do is I think I will start messing with the fog a bit here. So a good number to start with is just 0.01 for the fog density. And this is going to allow you to, you can see this is quite a bit of fog actually for this particular shot, because this is quite a long shot. So we're probably going to lower it later, but for now it should do. So what I'll do now is I'm going to change the fog color. In general, you might want the fog color to be closer to what the horizon color is. So in this case I might set it to something like this, and then if we disable the fog, you can see the horizon has sort of this almost yellowish bit on it, and now the fog also has this yellowish bit, and you'll also notice that we have this fog blending here. So we're going to want to turn down the fog blending, which we're gonna have some issues here because it appears. Okay, I've found the issue. So this is version 1.4.5 of Chunky, and what you're actually going to want to use is version 1.4.6 Snapshot 1. In order to get this, you're actually going to need to go to the Chunky launcher and check this box here under Advanced Settings that says Download Snapshots, and then click Check for Update, and then you can choose 1.4.6 Snapshot 1. Okay, so now that I've reloaded the scene, we can see now in this version we do in fact have the sky fog blending setting, which is what I want to deal with here. So you'll notice that the whole sky is basically orange now because we chose this sort of orange color for the fog, and we don't really want that. We do want the blue sky to show through. So in order to do this, we're just going to simply decrease the sky fog blending so that the blue sort of actually comes down into the sky here. And now you'll notice that the edge of the land here does stand out pretty badly against the background, so we were going to do this anyway, but now what we're going to do is actually decrease the amount of fog to, that seems about right. I'll make this a bit bigger now so we can sort of get a good look at what this might be in the final render. Yeah, that looks fine. So now what I'm going to do is just a few little things. I like to enable emitters and turn them all the way down. So this will make the emitters sort of show up as basically a single dot of light, and they're not going to actually emit light onto the things around them, but they will light up. And this may not make a huge difference if you don't have any emitters, but in this case I do have some torches along a road, and those are going to show up here, especially when I make this bigger for the final render. So now let's talk about sort of some framing here. If you're used to photography, you'll know about the rule of thirds, and you'll know that right here I'm failing miserably because I have my horizon right in the middle of the scene. So in general, it may not matter too much. I mean, you can do whatever you want, but the rule of thirds says that you want, instead of putting things dead center in your frame when you're taking a photo, you want to have it somewhere along a line that is 1/3 of the frame from the edge. So in this case, you can see I have about 1/3 of the frame from the top of the frame to the horizon, and then 2/3 from the horizon down to the bottom of the frame. And this is supposed to be more visually interesting than if I were to put the horizon in the center of the frame, like so. And then the other part of this is that you want whatever you're focusing on. So in this case, perhaps the focal point would be this building here. You want that to be sort of at the intersection of two of these 1/3 lines. So if I wanted to do that, then I would probably go right around here, which puts the horizon a little bit above the center line, and it puts this at about 1/3 from the left and 1/3 from the bottom. Maybe I can move it up a little bit, but there we go, something like that. And so now, since this has the most contrast and it really stands out, this is going to be sort of the focal point of the whole picture, and everything else is basically background. And so by putting it in this spot, it really draws attention, instead of putting it straight in the middle where you might expect you want to put the main focus of a picture. It's actually more interesting to put it somewhere else, because you would normally expect to look at something in the middle, and so in order to look at the actual focal point of the photo, you have to look away from the middle, and that requires just a little bit more work, you know, for your eyes to look at a different part, and that makes it more interesting. At least that's the basic theory as I would understand it. So in terms of the framing, that's what I think I'll go with here. I'm not too happy about the horizon not also being on a third line. I think it looks kind of wonky, but the only way to fix that would be to perhaps choose a higher elevation for the camera and then look down. So now the horizon is around 1/3 from the top, but it doesn't quite have the same effect that I want. I want it to be a bit more like that, so it's more like we're looking forwards rather than down onto the subject. Okay, so overall this is pretty good. Just gonna see if we can make a few more minor adjustments before we actually do final render. I'm pretty happy with the sun color I chose. I think it looks fine. Yeah, I think all the lighting settings are pretty good. You might want to mess with if your shadows are way too dark, which in this case I'm fine with the shadows being dark because I wanted more contrast. You could turn up the skylight, and this is actually going to make the shadows a lot lighter. But in this case that just looks ridiculous, especially because of all the snow in the background. When you have snow, it kind of screws with your lighting, so you're going to want to not turn up the skylight too much. So I'm just going to leave it at the default of 1 here. And the amount of fog, like I said, I think that's pretty good. In this case, to make it more interesting on the top, since we just have the sky here, it's kind of boring. You might think maybe we could perhaps turn on the clouds, and then if we move the clouds up to say 180 or so, made them a bit smaller perhaps, now we have a more interesting sky. The problem is that in Chunky we can't just render infinite land. You could enable water world mode to try and alleviate this, but it wouldn't quite be, it wouldn't really be the same effect. But you can see that here, this is where the horizon actually is. And so when we look at this point, you can see the clouds just stop, because that's where the horizon is. Even though there's nothing there in the frame, which there normally would be, because that's where the horizon is, in real life, you wouldn't have this hole in the horizon. And so this actually looks very unnatural, because we have just a straight line stretching across the screen in the background here where the clouds stop. So in this case, this isn't going to work out so well. If I were using a lower camera angle, then you can see that line actually disappears. And this actually would be a pretty good render. Now that I think about it, I might actually just go with this. The issue now being that the framing is even more off. So in this case, it might be a good idea to just zoom in a bit and look up. So now we maintain the position of this building here, but we've gotten rid of that weird line at the horizon where the clouds stop. And I think this is actually a pretty good look. And in this case, I think instead of focusing on the mountains in the background like we did initially, I'm actually just going to change it and focus on this building. And now I'm going to lower the depth of field again. So now we have focus on this building, and the mountains in the background are going to be a little bit blurry. So the next thing I want to do, because these clouds, what's happening is actually they're casting a shadow on this building, whereas before we had this really nice contrast between the left side of the building and the right side of the building where it was being struck by the sunlight. So we're going to want to find a cloud configuration, so to speak, that doesn't do that. So we're just going to sort of play with the cloud positioning. Oh, there we go. That was easy. So yeah, so now this building is in full sunlight. It doesn't have any of the cloud shadows on it. So that's good. You may have to mess around with it significantly more than what I just did, but for me it worked just moving them a little bit so that this was no longer in shadow. Alright, so now we can make this a little bit bigger, see what we're looking at here. So I'm thinking that this is going to look, this is pretty good as it is. If you wanted to get really fancy, another thing, there's not really much water in the scene. There's a little bit perhaps here in the foreground. You could change the water. I think this actual default custom watercolor here looks pretty nice. It's a bit, the default water is more clear, I guess, and you're looking through to the bottom more, and it actually looks darker because of that. Whereas if you do this, you end up with this color, which is quite dark, but it actually shows up pretty bright. You can make it ridiculously bright if you really wanted to. You can see how this almost looks like it's glowing. You could actually make it glow if you change the material properties, but that's a bit more advanced. Cover that in a different video. So for now I'm just going to make it a little bit darker so it doesn't stand out too much, but I do like this color. And you can see the difference here is not too much, but here the water seems almost perhaps a bit more reflective, and here the water stands out a little bit more. It's a little bit brighter, but not too much. Alright, I think that's going to be good. So I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to render this in 4K. So to do that, we're just going to press X2, now it's 1080p, Then you press X2 again, and it will make it really big, much bigger than my screen, 4 times as big as my screen, of course. And I'm going to render this, and I will get back to you when it's done, and I'll show you the result. We'll wait for the first frame here. Might take a while. There we go. So this is just the first sample. Obviously, quite noisy. But we'll wait for maybe a couple hundred samples, and I'll get back to you. So I just wanted to cut back in here real quickly to show this is 100 samples per pixel, actually 101 now. And so you can see that in the foreground, the things that are lit up very well by the sun are in general very clear. They're not noisy at all. And you can see the parts in focus with this building are very nice, not blurry or anything. Whereas the parts in the background, you'll notice, actually do have a bit more noise, especially on the clouds. When we look at the clouds, especially in the shadows, you're going to see a great deal of noise. And this is at 104 now samples per pixel. So when you're dealing with shadows on flat objects like this, the noise is going to become very visible, essentially, is what I'm getting at. And so, like on this building here, if you look at the shadowed side of it, you'll notice that it's really hard to actually pick out the noise because it has a texture. So the texture of the blocks itself is going to sort of obscure the noise. The noise is still there, and if you look very closely at this render, you would see that in fact it is very noisy in the shadowed area. But because there's a texture there, it sort of cuts through the noise, and your mind recognizes the texture rather than just seeing noise. Whereas on these clouds, you only see the noise because there's no texture. So we'll go ahead and wait for a bit more to render out, and hopefully we'll be able to cut down that noise a little bit before I show you the final render. Alright, so here we are at 234 samples per pixel. I have paused the render here, and I'm going to save this out to my renders folder here. Just save. And now we'll go ahead and take a look at that final render. So here it is. This is the full size. So with the 234 samples per pixel, you'll notice that the noise on the clouds is still actually pretty prominent. If we look in, you can see there's really a great deal of noise, especially of course on the darker areas, which is how it would be in, you know, real life. If you were taking a photo, it'd be the same idea, especially with like a higher camera speed. So, or film speed specifically. And yet here, like I said, on the lighter areas, you can't tell that there's any noise. It's there, it's just that the texture cuts through it. And same here with the texture on the darker area. You can start to see a bit more noise right in here. So besides the noise, and you know, you could render this out to like 4,000 samples per pixel, and yeah, the noise would be pretty much gone then. But you're gonna have pretty severe diminishing returns as you go. The rule of thumb is that in order to cut down the noise by half, you have to multiply the samples per pixel by 4, not by 2, but by 4. And so, for example, from me going from 100 to 200, it didn't actually cut down the noise in half. Instead, really only took off maybe less than a third of the noise. Maybe a quarter or so. I'm not sure if it's linear like that. But anyway, so you'll notice just some details here, that the mountain's very far in the background here. The edges are nice and blurred. They're a bit faded because we have that slight fog on them. The boundary between the sky and the horizon is no longer sharply visible because we do retain some of that fog blending. So this looks quite natural here. And we don't have that sharp line where the clouds end. Instead, the clouds just sort of fade into this pure white look here. And actually, you can see right here, this little bit of almost blue is actually where the clouds are ending, right here. So I actually messed up a little bit. Should have moved the camera down a little bit more to avoid that. But that's probably the lowest point on the horizon, so no one's really going to notice that, except for the fact that I just pointed it out, so now you'll all notice it. It's right there. You know it's there. Anyway, so things in the background, because of the slight fog, faded, like I said, slightly blurred. You'll notice the foreground also slightly blurry, and everything here is in focus. So it's essentially a very similar process to taking a real photograph. We are ray tracing, or rather in this case, I believe path tracing, which is a form of ray tracing. It's just a little bit more fancy. But yeah, so this one, you know, I did in 4K. Now I make sure to save these out as a PNG file, which is going to be lossless compression. You don't want to save them out as a JPEG. It's going to look like crap, especially on a really big file. And when you upload these to share them wherever you do, it's highly likely that, like, if you just upload it to Imager, it's going to convert it into a JPEG, and it's going to convert it with a really low quality. And this is going to show pretty badly on higher resolution images like this one. So if you want people to actually see your render in high quality, if it's really big, you're not going to want to upload it to, like, Imager. You're going to want to use something that is higher quality, and maybe perhaps just something that's like a more general purpose file sharing site. Or, I mean, if you can host it yourself, then feel free to host it yourself. But you're not going to want to use something that's just going to convert it to a JPEG so that it's as small as possible when people see it, because it's going to look like crap. I mean, for the general purposes of, like, when I just upload something just to show it on the Chunky subreddit or whatever, I just put it on Imager, because it's more about conveying the general feeling in the image and sort of just showing off the effects that you can achieve rather than the quality, because everyone knows you can get really good quality out of these renders, of course, but I like to sort of show off the different, basically, the camera and lighting tricks that you can do with the program, rather than just, oh, here's a really high resolution image, woohoo. But of course, ideally we would have the highest possible quality, which would be a lossless compression here, and this file is probably quite large. In this case, it's, wow, I'm failing at clicking on the right thing. It is 11.1 megabytes, and I'm quite sure that if you uploaded that to Imager, it would certainly compress it into a very crappy JPEG. I think anything over 8 megabytes or so gets compressed really badly on Imager. So that's about it. This is the final view. I suppose I can full screen. Ooh. So hopefully this has given you a good idea of sort of the general process. The whole rendering, it took 2 hours to render these 234 samples per pixel, and that is on 16 threads of a Ryzen 7 2700X. So yeah, that's a pretty decent processor. So if your processor is weaker than that, then this might start becoming a very, very long process for you to render these out. The developer has mentioned interest, of course, in trying to figure out a GPU solution for rendering these, but that would probably, of course, require a complete rewrite of the actual rendering engine. So that's something that is probably a very long ways off if he ever manages to get around to that. At the moment, he's dealing with just trying to get 1.13 support, because Minecraft 1.13 actually changed the way the world files are actually like structured entirely. So it's almost a complete rewrite of how to parse the worlds and actually form an octree out of them. So it's been quite a while. We have not gotten that update yet for various reasons. Anyway, hopefully we'll get 1.13 support, and eventually we will get GPU rendering support, because this does take a very long time, especially for a larger image. Now, when I'm doing renders, just to sort of like with this, it's less, this is very, it's sort of a very crafted render where I'm focusing a lot on like the exact view and the composition, and all the settings are very carefully adjusted in order to achieve this. But a lot of the times I'll go in, and it may take me even less than 5 minutes just to set everything up and just make a render, and I'll render it for example, this one's only 25 samples per pixel. So you can see there's a ton of noise here in these blurrier areas. It's the fog, there's probably too much fog, the lighting could be perhaps further away so that this isn't, this has more shadows on it or whatever. But the general idea is that I just sort of want to, I kind of just want to take a picture, and so like with this, it only, or actually apparently, sorry, this is 52 samples per pixel, but this is also only 1080p. That's the other thing. So if you do it 1080p, obviously it's 4 times faster than 4K. And so with this 52 samples per pixel, it's already 4 times, or 1/4 of the samples per pixel is this render, and it's 1/4 of the size. So it's going to take 1/16 of the time, so only a few minutes to render this out. Perhaps here's another example. This one's only 42 samples per pixel. And as like a general, like if this was just, if someone just gave you a photograph that looked like this, you're not going to complain about, oh look, all this noise in the dark area, this bad. You're going to say it's bad. No one's going to actually say it's bad, So like, yes, there's a lot of noise in the clouds here, but I personally, I wouldn't care if somebody showed me a photograph, as long as the noise isn't so bad that I can't see anything. I care a lot more about the composition. I care a lot more about the general effect that the photograph has on the atmosphere than I care about the technical details of, how good is their camera. It doesn't matter so much as actually choosing the right lighting, choosing the right amount of fog, getting a good camera angle, knowing where to put the focus. That stuff is all way more important than rendering it out to 10,000 samples per pixel or whatever, because the effect that you get across, even though it may be more polished at 10,000 samples per pixel, the effect of this is going to be essentially the same. This is a perfectly good image, and anyone who's complaining about a little bit of noise here, kind of, if someone's complaining about the noise, then your image either isn't well composed enough, because if they have time to care about the noise, then your image obviously isn't striking enough to make them ignore that, or they're just kind of being annoying and caring about things that don't really matter. So don't worry about trying to render things out forever. I know it can be frustrating to have to wait 4 hours or whatever to see the final product, but I mean, that's how 3D rendering is. That's how it's always been, and it's probably how it always will be, because in the future, even though everything will get faster, even if we get GPU support, yeah, it'll be faster, but if we have GPU support, by the time we get that, people are going to be using maybe 8K monitors. I mean, who knows? You know, you're gonna want to make bigger images, and so everything, you know, it never really actually speeds up in the world of 3D rendering. You look at crappy old 90s CG from anything, you know, any movie or whatever, and you're like, you know, you think, oh, that would take, you know, 5 seconds to render now, and maybe it took them 3 hours to render it back in the 90s. But if you actually look, you know, the thing is that the technology has improved, but so has the standards. You know, so a modern movie, that sort of crappy CG wouldn't fly. So it's the same, you know, it's the same principle with this. So, you know, an old crappy photograph, if it's well composed and has good lighting, it doesn't matter if it's kind of noisy, you know. The base technology doesn't matter. I don't know why I'm talking about this. Anyway, hopefully you were able to learn something from this video, or at least be somewhat entertained by the process. And this video's gotten way too long, so I'll just leave you there. Bye.